Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The evening sun melted into the skyline of Port Harcourt, bathing the rooftops in the color of ripe oranges and wet rust. The city hummed beneath its glow, generators groaning, children chasing footballs, the sharp aroma of roasted corn floating through the air like memory itself. Juliet sat by her window, her hands resting on a pile of folded fabrics she intended to sell the next day. She loved this time of day, when the sky softened and the world exhaled. Her life, though simple, was woven tightly with little joys. Her husband Patrick's quiet laughter at dinner, the rhythmic chatter of her children Ethan and Maya as they did homework, the comforting chaos of their small compound in Remulla. It was not wealth that filled her home but warmth, the kind that could soften even the hardest heart. Yet that night, as the shadows deepened and the city's heartbeat grew louder, a phone call from Enugu would slice through the calm like a sharp blade through cloth. Clara's voice trembled on the other end, hoarse and thin, as if carried by wind rather than wires. "Julie, my dear sister, I need your help." Juliet's stomach tightened. Something in Clara's tone carried the weight of desperation. Clara explained between pauses that her health was failing again. The hospital visits had drained her, and her son Daniel, now 18, needed a place to stay, at least for a while. Juliet pressed the phone closer, hearing the faint coughs in the background, the strain of fatigue behind Clara's words. "You mean he should stay here? With us?" she asked gently. "Please," Clara whispered. "Just until I'm stronger." Juliet looked around the living room, where her children's laughter had just faded into the evening. Family had always been her compass. Saying no felt like breaking a law older than time. "Send him," she said finally. "He's my son too." Daniel arrived 3 days later, stepping out of a rickety bus with a small bag slung over his shoulder and eyes that darted like someone unused to kindness. He greeted them politely, his voice barely louder than the hum of distant traffic. Juliet welcomed him with open arms, offering food, water, and a bed as though he were her own child returning from a long journey. Patrick, though cordial, observed quietly from the doorway, his engineer's mind already reading between the boys' silences. Daniel was lean, with restless energy under his skin, the kind that speaks of long nights and too many unspoken thoughts. At dinner he spoke little, replying with nods, smiling when addressed. Ethan, however, was fascinated. To the 12-year-old, Daniel was everything cool, tall, older, mysterious. That night, as rain began to whisper against the tin roof, Juliet found herself smiling at the thought of family gathered under one roof again. She called Clara to say, "He's safe here." "Don't worry." Clara's tired sigh of relief filled her heart like balm. But as Juliet ended the call, she couldn't shake off Patrick's earlier words. "Julie, kindness is a seed, but we must pray it doesn't fall on stony ground." She brushed it aside, believing love was enough to smooth any rough edge. In the quiet that followed, the city's hum felt heavier than usual, as though it, too, carried secrets waiting to unfold. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their lives adjusted to the presence of a new voice in the house. Daniel helped with chores, washed Patrick's car on Saturdays, and carried Maya's school bag like a protective older brother. He had a charm that was easy to like, the kind that made neighbors nod approvingly. Juliet felt proud of Clara's son, proud of her decision. She often told Patrick, "You see, God rewards good hearts." Patrick would nod, but his silence was never empty. It lingered like smoke that refused to rise. He noticed Daniel's late-night whispers on the phone, his sudden disappearances to meet a friend, and the way his eyes flickered when asked simple questions. Juliet noticed too, but she drowned her doubts in prayers and excuses. "He's a boy," she told herself. "Boys drift before they find direction." But one Sunday morning, when she reached for her savings to pay the children's school fees, her hand met nothing but air. The brown envelope was gone. Her chest tightened. She searched again, until denial turned to dread. She said nothing until nightfall, hoping the money might somehow reappear, as if guilt itself could return it. When Patrick found out, his face hardened. "Julie," he said slowly, "not everything that comes from blood carries blessing." But Juliet begged for patience, swearing it was a mistake. Her heart refused to draw a line where family began and betrayal might start. By the end of the month, the storm that Juliet refused to see was already gathering in silence. Daniel's phone buzzed with numbers she didn't recognize, his laughter turned brittle, his eyes shadowed. Still, Juliet kept believing. She made his favorite stew, included him in family prayers, and told Clara over the phone that everything was fine. She didn't notice the new distance in Patrick's touch, the worry in Ethan's eyes, or the way Maya had begun to hide behind her when Daniel entered the room. The city outside kept moving, horns blaring, hawkers shouting, music spilling from roadside bars. But inside their home, something quiet and unseen began to rot. Juliet, in her boundless kindness, mistook silence for peace. And peace, like glass, can look solid until the first crack appears. The sound of morning in Port Harcourt was never gentle. It came alive with the rattling of Kiki engines, the cries of street hawkers, and the clinking of bottles as vendors set up their stalls. Inside Juliet's compound, the sun poured through half-drawn curtains, scattering light across polished tiles and the faint aroma of yesterday's stew. Daniel had now spent 2 months with them, and to anyone who visited, it looked as though he'd always belonged there. He helped Juliet at the market sometimes, carrying heavy bags without complaint. Neighbors would smile and say, "You're lucky, Madame Juliet. That boy is a blessing." She would nod with quiet pride, unaware that every smile from Daniel carried a shadow. Patrick, on the other hand, still watched him with a silent wariness. He couldn't name what bothered him, only that sometimes Daniel's laughter came too quickly, like someone acting a part. At night, Juliet would dismiss Patrick's suspicions. "He's just a teenager finding his way," she would say, her voice soft with maternal certainty. But somewhere in her chest, a small voice of doubt whispered questions she didn't want to ask. When she woke in the middle of the night to fetch water, she'd see the faint glow under Daniel's door, the quiet murmur of a phone call, and tell herself not to imagine things. Love, she believed, meant patience. And patience, she thought, meant turning a blind eye until good revealed itself. Ethan adored his cousin. The boy had become his hero, teaching him football tricks in the dusty backyard, showing him how to whistle through his fingers, and letting him try on his sneakers even though they were too big. Daniel called him my guy, and Ethan would beam with pride whenever his cousin said it. One afternoon, Daniel brought home a group of young men who reeked of cheap cologne and street swagger. They sat in the veranda laughing too loudly, their eyes darting around the house with an ease that unsettled Patrick. When Juliet returned from the shop and saw them, she frowned slightly but said nothing. She didn't want to embarrass Daniel in front of his friends. Later that evening, she spoke to him privately. "Next time, tell me before you bring people over," she said. Daniel nodded, apologetic, his smile disarming enough to melt her irritation. "Yes, Auntie, I understand. It won't happen again." Yet the next weekend, the same boys returned, and this time they stayed longer. Juliet heard fragments of their conversation, talk about quick cash, someone's new ride, a deal that would soon click. The words meant little to her, but Patrick's eyes hardened. That night he said, "Julie, something is wrong with that boy. He's not just hanging around ordinary friends." She sighed. "Patrick, please. Don't judge him by his friends. You don't know his heart." Patrick didn't argue further, but the silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the words neither of them dared to speak aloud. By the 4th month, Daniel had become both part of the family and apart from it. He moved around the house like a shadow that didn't always match the light. Juliet began to notice small things going missing. Patrick's wristwatch, a few thousand naira from her drawer, Ethan's new phone charger. Each time she confronted him, Daniel's eyes widened with wounded innocence. "Auntie, you think I'll steal from you? God forbid." And her guilt would drown her suspicion. She'd apologize, telling him to forget it. But Patrick's patience had worn thin. "This boy is a storm waiting to happen," he warned. "You're sheltering him under our roof, but when the wind blows, we'll be the ones it scatters." Still, Juliet refused to hear it. In her heart, she clung to the memory of Clara's frail voice begging her for help. To betray that trust felt like betraying her own blood. So she cooked his favorite egusi soup, ironed his shirts before Sunday service, and prayed silently that love could straighten whatever curve life had put in Daniel's path. But love is a fragile thing. It bends easily under the weight of denial. Every night when Daniel slipped out quietly through the back gate, Juliet told herself he was only restless. She never followed to see where he went, because deep down, she feared the truth her eyes might find. The calm before a storm is often mistaken for peace. By the end of the 6th month, their home seemed more alive than ever. Daniel cracked jokes at dinner that made Maya giggle until tears ran down her cheeks. Even Patrick began to relax, thinking perhaps he had misjudged the boy. Juliet felt a wave of relief, grateful that patience had proved her right. One humid evening, while thunder rolled far away, she prepared a pot of jollof rice and watched the children play in the sitting room. Daniel leaned on the doorway, phone in hand, texting rapidly. When she asked who he was chatting with, he smiled. Just a friend, Auntie. The simplicity of his tone brushed away her curiosity. Later that night, she would remember that smile and realize it had been the quiet grin of a mind already lost to darker intentions. But for now, she was content, humming softly as she served the meal. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, and the city lights flickered like restless spirits. Juliet didn't know that beyond those raindrops, Daniel's other world, one built on lies, desperation, and whispered promises, was closing in, ready to burst open and swallow everything she loved whole. The rain had come hard that week, turning the streets of Port Harcourt into long mirrors that reflected a city losing its patience. Power outages stretched into nights of sweating silence, and thunder cracked over rooftops like a warning no one could hear. Inside Juliet's home, the smell of wet clothes and kerosene mixed with the thick tension that now floated between them like invisible smoke. Daniel had grown quieter, but not in the way that meant peace. His quiet was the silence of planning, the stillness before movement. Juliet noticed him pacing sometimes at night, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and hurried. When she asked, he would smile and say, "Just my friends, Auntie. We're talking about football." But there was a new sharpness in his tone, a kind of secret edge that sliced through the warmth of their home. Ethan still followed him like a shadow, proud to be included in every little adventure. Juliet often watched them together from the veranda, her heart swelling at the sight of their laughter. But Patrick's eyes had hardened, he no longer laughed with them. When Daniel left for errands, Patrick started checking the gate, sometimes even waiting to hear which direction he went. "That boy is building a wall between himself and truth," he said once, and Juliet had only sighed, refusing to believe her heart's choice could be so wrong. Yet even she could feel something shifting. The air in the house had changed, too heavy, too still. It was as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Daniel's new friends came around less often, but when they did, they arrived in borrowed cars and expensive sneakers, leaving the smell of cigarette smoke and fake perfume hanging in the air long after they left. He had started dressing differently too, flashy shirts, a gold chain that glinted in the sun, and a confidence that felt almost rehearsed. He would talk of business deals and small hustles, words Juliet barely understood but chose not to question. She only prayed silently that whatever he was doing, he would not lose himself completely. One Sunday morning, when Patrick left for church early, Juliet found Daniel counting wads of cash on his bed. He froze when he saw her. "Where did you get all that?" she asked, her voice low, afraid of the answer. He smiled that same easy smile and said, "A friend owed me, Auntie. I helped him sort something." She didn't believe him, but the weight of love can make even lies sound gentle. She walked out of the room with trembling hands, telling herself not to make a scene. In her mind, she repeated the same silent prayer, "Lord, protect this boy from himself." Yet even as she prayed, Daniel was already making promises to men who spoke of ransom and quick fortune. The street had caught him in its teeth, and it would not let go. Juliet's house, which once smelled of food and laughter, now held a restless energy, like a drumbeat in the distance that no one else could hear. Ethan's innocence became the thread that held Juliet together. Her son adored Daniel with a loyalty that frightened her sometimes. The boy would wait by the gate for him to come home, carry his slippers, ask endless questions about the world outside their compound. Daniel encouraged it. He liked the feeling of control, the way Ethan's eyes lit up when he spoke. "One day I'll take you out," he would say. "Show you what real life looks like." Juliet overheard him once and warned gently, "Daniel, don't fill his head with dreams he's not ready for." He only laughed. "Auntie, I'm teaching him how to survive." But what Daniel called survival was already something darker, something that would soon stretch beyond control. The gang he had joined saw opportunity in his proximity to Juliet's family. They told him stories of easy ransom, of money so clean it could wash away all his past mistakes. The thought planted itself in him like a poisonous seed. He told himself he would only help once, only get enough to start a new life. But greed, once fed, grows teeth. By the time Juliet sensed the danger, it was already too late. Daniel had begun to see the boy he once protected as a tool, a way to pay his debts. Ethan, too trusting to suspect anything, followed his cousin's every word like scripture. The day the plan took shape, the weather was painfully beautiful. The rain had stopped, the sky bluer than it had been in weeks, and the streets hummed with the noise of people returning to their routines. Juliet rose early, humming as she prepared breakfast, unaware that her home was standing on the edge of its own undoing. Daniel watched her quietly, guilt flickering across his face for the briefest moment. He told her he would stay home with Ethan, that they might watch a movie or play a game. She smiled, relieved that they were bonding again, that perhaps the storm had passed. Before leaving for the market, she kissed Ethan's forehead and said, "Stay close to your cousin. I'll be back soon." He nodded happily, not knowing his world was about to shift forever. As Juliet walked down the street, her bag clutched tightly to her side, she felt oddly light, like someone who had survived a sickness without realizing the fever hadn't broken yet. At home, Daniel's phone vibrated. He read the message silently. Everything set. "Bring him now." His hand trembled for a moment, but greed smothered hesitation. He looked at Ethan and said softly, "Let's take a walk. I've got a surprise for you." The boy followed without question, laughing as they disappeared down the street, leaving behind only the echo of innocence fading into the noise of the city. The afternoon heat sat thick over Port Harcourt like a heavy blanket, and the city moved with the slow rhythm of exhaustion. Juliet walked home from the market, the strap of her handbag pressing into her shoulder, her mind busy with small thoughts. The price of Gary, the smile on Ethan's face when she promised his favorite dinner, the sound of Patrick's voice teasing her about overspending again. She reached her compound gate humming a tune she had picked up from a radio vendor, unaware that her world had already slipped out of balance. When she pushed the gate open, the yard was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that comes when the air is holding something it can't bear to say. She stepped inside, expecting to hear Ethan's laughter or Daniel's voice from the sitting room. Instead, the only sound was the steady ticking of the wall clock and the faint buzz of flies near the kitchen. "Ethan!" she called, her voice rising slightly. No answer. She tried again louder, but only her echo came back. Panic began to crawl into her chest, sharp and cold. She checked every room, the backyard, the neighbor's fence line, but her son was nowhere. His slippers sat by the couch, and his phone charger was plugged into the wall. That small detail, the charger without a phone, made her heart race faster. She dialed his number with trembling fingers, praying to hear his cheerful mummy on the other end. Instead, a deep voice she didn't know answered, rough and deliberate. "Madam, if you love your son, don't call again. Wait for our instructions." The line went dead. Juliet's world tilted. The walls blurred. The bag she carried fell from her shoulder and scattered its contents across the floor. Patrick arrived minutes later to find her kneeling in the middle of the sitting room, her hands gripping the phone like it could still speak. "Juliet, what happened?" he asked, his own voice breaking. She could barely form the words. "Ethan, he's gone. Someone took him." Patrick's eyes darkened as if a shadow had passed over his soul. He stormed out to the street, shouting his son's name, knocking on neighbors' gates, demanding if anyone had seen a young boy with his nephew. But no one had seen anything. One neighbor mentioned seeing the gate open earlier, another recalled hearing a car door slam, but none could say where they went. Patrick came back drenched in sweat, his shirt clinging to his chest, his breath ragged. "Where's Daniel?" he asked. Juliet froze. She hadn't even thought of that yet. They searched his room. His bag was gone, his clothes scattered, his bed unmade. On the floor, she found a crumpled sheet of paper with scribbled numbers and the word Oroweruquo written in haste. It meant nothing to her, but Patrick knew the name of that area, a place people spoke of in whispers, where lost things and lost people often met their end. Juliet clung to him, sobbing, "No, not Daniel. He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't." But Patrick's silence said what his mouth refused to voice. He knew the truth they both feared. The hours that followed crawled like years. The police were called, their questions mechanical, their sympathy rehearsed. "We'll do our best, madam," they said, but their eyes already told her how many mothers had heard those same words before. Juliet refused to sit still. She followed every lead, called every number she could, her voice cracking under the weight of desperation. Patrick, though broken, tried to stay steady, contacting anyone who might help. The kidnappers called again that night, their tone colder, their demands clear. 200,000 naira or they would end the story. Juliet pleaded through tears, "Please, don't hurt him. I'll get the money, just please." The man laughed, a sound that made her blood freeze. "You better hurry. The boy is scared." Then he hung up. The sound of that laughter haunted her every second after. Sleep became impossible. Food turned to dust in her mouth. Every noise outside the window made her flinch. Patrick sat in the corner of their bedroom, head bowed, fists clenched. "I warned you about that boy," he said finally, his voice heavy, not with anger, but with defeat. Juliet broke down again, crying until her voice disappeared into the night. Outside, thunder rolled, and the rain began to fall, each drop hitting the roof like the ticking of a clock counting down to something terrible. 3 days passed before the call came that changed everything. The police had tracked a number to a small, abandoned building on the edge of Ellenwoe. Juliet and Patrick followed them there, the road muddy from rain, the air thick with dread. When they arrived, flashing lights painted the crumbling walls in red and blue. Officers were shouting, dragging out young men with faces hardened by fear. Then she saw him, Daniel, his hands cuffed behind his back, his head bowed low. Juliet froze. Her knees trembled. She could barely breathe. A police officer guided her forward. "Madam, your son was found alive. He's shaken but safe." The words sank slowly like stones into water. Then she saw Ethan, small, trembling, eyes wide like someone who had stared too long into darkness. She ran to him, collapsing into his arms, sobbing against his hair. "I'm here, my baby, I'm here." Ethan clung to her, silent tears soaking her dress. When she finally turned toward Daniel, he couldn't look at her. His lips moved, forming words that came out cracked and broken. "Auntie, I didn't mean for it to go this far. They said it would be quick money. I swear, I didn't want him hurt." Juliet could only stare, her heart splitting open under the weight of betrayal. She wanted to scream, to strike him, to ask why, but no words came. Behind him, the other boys watched quietly, some ashamed, others defiant. The officer pushed them toward a waiting van, and as Daniel passed her, he whispered, "I'm sorry." She turned away, her tears hot and endless, knowing sorry could never undo what he had done. The drive home that night was silent. Ethan sat between them, clutching her hand. Juliet stared out the window, watching the city lights blur, her reflection staring back, older, broken, and forever changed. Juliet sat by the window long after dawn broke, her eyes swollen and red, her body motionless except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. The events of the past days had unfolded like a nightmare with no waking point, each hour stretching endlessly, each minute echoing with her son's cries in that abandoned house. Port Harcourt carried on outside her window, hawkers calling, traffic honking, radios blaring, but inside her home, time had turned to stone. Patrick moved silently through the rooms, avoiding words, avoiding her gaze. Even the children spoke in whispers now, as if loud voices could shatter what little peace remained. Ethan had barely eaten since his return. He stared often into space, his small hands trembling when he heard sudden sounds. At night, Juliet heard him whimper in his sleep, calling for her, sometimes crying out Daniel's name. Each time, she would rush to his room, hold him close, and rock him until his breathing steadied. Yet even in her arms, she felt the distance that fear had built between them, a space so wide that no mother's love could fully bridge it. The laughter that once filled their home had vanished, replaced by the hum of pain too heavy for words. Juliet's sister Clara had called every day since Daniel's arrest, her voice breaking under waves of guilt. "Julie, I don't know how to face you," she said through tears. But Juliet couldn't summon anger. Her pain was too deep, her soul too weary. Anger was for those who still had strength, and she had none left. The trial came swiftly, though nothing about it felt just. The police had gathered enough evidence, the ransom calls traced, the money marked, the other accomplices turning against Daniel to save themselves. Juliet and Patrick sat in the courtroom, the air thick with whispers, flashes from journalists' cameras lighting the faces of strangers who would tell their story without ever understanding it. When Daniel was brought in, dressed in prison brown, Juliet could barely recognize him. His eyes were dull, his frame thinner, his face drawn by regret or fear, or both. Their gazes met once, and in that instant, she saw flashes of the boy who had first walked into her house with quiet gratitude. For a moment, she almost believed that version of him still existed somewhere under the wreckage. But the moment passed when the prosecutor read out the details of the crime. How Daniel had lured Ethan out with promises of a surprise, how he had stood watch while the others made the call demanding money, how he had spent part of the ransom before the police arrived. Juliet felt her chest tighten with every word. Ethan sat beside her, clutching her hand so tightly it hurt. When Daniel's lawyer spoke of youth and bad influence, begging for mercy, Juliet closed her eyes. Mercy, she thought, was a beautiful word until it was asked for the wrong reasons. The judge's sentence came down like iron, years behind bars. Daniel's shoulders slumped, his face buried in his palms. Juliet didn't cry. Her tears had already run dry. As they led him away, he turned briefly toward her, lips trembling as if to speak. She couldn't bear to listen. Her heart had already heard enough. Life after the trial was a slow walk through ashes. People in the neighborhood tried to comfort her, but sympathy has a way of cutting deeper than silence. Some whispered that she had brought trouble upon herself by housing a boy she barely knew. Others pitied her with eyes full of judgment. Patrick returned to work, but spoke little of what had happened. His pride, once strong as steel, had bent under the weight of shame. The man who used to tell jokes at the dinner table now ate quietly and left early for his shifts. Juliet went back to the market after some weeks, but her usual customers noticed her distant stare, the way her smile no longer reached her eyes. The vibrant woman who once lit up the stalls now moved like a ghost among them. She spent her evenings cooking more food than anyone could eat, as if trying to fill the hollow inside her with the rhythm of something familiar. Maya, too young to understand the full meaning of betrayal, often asked, "Mummy, when will Cousin Daniel come back?" Juliet would pause, swallow hard, and answer softly, "Not soon, my dear." Each time she said it, her chest tightened. She had promised herself to stop crying, but sometimes tears came uninvited, streaming quietly as she washed dishes or folded clothes that no longer smelled of peace. Months slipped by, and though wounds began to close, scars remained etched into the rhythm of their days. Ethan returned to school but struggled to smile. The boy who once filled their home with chatter now spoke in half sentences, his laughter cautious, like something borrowed. Juliet tried to shield him from the shadows that lingered, but trauma has a way of seeping through walls. Patrick began to heal in his own quiet way, channeling his pain into work, finding solace in silence. Juliet, however, carried her grief differently. She found herself avoiding strangers, avoiding trust. When neighbors came seeking help or comfort, she politely declined, her once open heart now guarded by invisible gates. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the window, she sat alone on the couch, watching the city lights blink through the downpour. Ethan was asleep, Patrick reading quietly beside her. The sound of thunder rolled faintly in the distance, and Juliet whispered to herself, "Kindness is a beautiful thing until it breaks you." The words hung in the air, soft but sharp, wrapping around her like truth she could no longer deny. She didn't hate Daniel, not truly, but she could no longer love the world the same way. She had learned that goodness, though noble, could sometimes open doors evil was waiting to walk through. And as the storm outside deepened, she made a silent vow never to be caught unguarded again, her heart folding in on itself like a bird learning not to fly. The first harmattan after the trial came early, scraping the skies above Port Harcourt and filling the mornings with dust that clung to lips and eyelashes. Juliet woke before dawn, long before the roosters cried or the city began to stir. The air in the house was thin, almost fragile, as if the walls themselves held their breath. She walked quietly into the sitting room, her wrapper dragging softly against the floor, and sat near the window where faint gray light trickled through the curtains. Her gaze drifted toward the gate outside, the same gate Daniel once walked through smiling, the same gate her son had disappeared beyond. It had been nearly a year since that day, yet the memories lived inside her like old wounds that refused to heal. She thought of Clara often, the few phone calls they still shared steeped in guilt and silence. Her sister's health had improved, but her spirit was heavy with shame. "Julie," Clara said during their last call, "I pray every day that you'll forgive me." Juliet had paused before answering. "There's nothing to forgive," she said. "We both loved him. We just didn't know how broken he was." After that, words became useless. Sometimes at night, Juliet still dreamed of Daniel as a small boy playing barefoot on dusty streets, laughing without secrets. When she woke, she would stare at the ceiling and wonder if he too dreamed of home. Ethan had changed in ways Juliet couldn't undo. He was taller now, his once round face sharper, his smile more guarded. The cheerful boy who used to run to her after school now moved with a cautiousness that broke her heart. At night, he locked his doors. During the day, he preferred silence. When strangers came by, even harmless ones, he watched them with suspicion. "People wear faces like masks, Mum," he said once, his tone too old for his age. "You never know who's underneath." Juliet had no answer. What could she say? The world had already taught him the lesson too early, that monsters don't always come from dark corners. Sometimes they share your table, eat your food, call you family. Patrick tried to help, but even he carried invisible bruises. There were nights he'd sit outside under the mango tree, staring at the moon, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. Juliet often joined him there, both of them silent, their grief stretching between them like an unspoken language. Some evenings she would whisper, "Do you ever think we'll be the same again?" Patrick would sigh, his eyes on the sky. "No," he'd say softly, "but maybe we can learn to live with the difference." The words stayed with her long after, heavy yet strangely comforting. The cracks in their lives hadn't closed, but at least they were still standing amid the ruins. Months passed, and Juliet slowly began to rebuild herself, piece by piece. She returned to her shop at the market, arranging fabrics with care, her movements slower but more deliberate. The women who once gossiped about her now greeted her with cautious kindness, sensing the quiet strength she carried. She no longer entertained idle chatter, nor did she open her door to every need that came knocking. One afternoon, a young girl from the next compound came begging for help with school fees. The old Juliet would have rushed to assist, no questions asked, but this Juliet hesitated. Her heart waged war against her mind, compassion pulling one way, fear the other. She ended up giving the girl half of what she asked for, whispering, "Take this and use it wisely." The girl thanked her and left, and Juliet sat long after, staring at her hands. Her generosity was no longer boundless. It came with boundaries now, edges carved by experience. She had learned the hard way that love without caution was like a house with open doors in a storm. It welcomed everyone, but it also let destruction in. Yet, deep down, she still wished to believe in goodness. She still prayed quietly for Daniel, for his mother, even for the nameless boys who had followed him down that dark road. Not because she excused them, but because she knew hatred would only chain her to the past. The night before Ethan's 13th birthday, the family gathered for dinner. It was a simple meal, fried rice, grilled chicken, laughter that felt rusty but real. For the first time in a long while, their home glowed softly again. Patrick told a story from his youth that made Maya giggle uncontrollably, and Juliet watched her children, her eyes filling not with sadness but something gentler, acceptance. When they finished eating, she stepped outside for air. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when the wind carries secrets away. The moon hung full above the city, silver and distant, and she thought of all the nights she had prayed for peace and received only silence. Tonight, that silence felt different, less cruel, almost forgiving. She whispered into the night, "I can't keep hating the world for breaking me. I just have to live through it." The words drifted upward, swallowed by the wind. Inside, Patrick called out, "Julie, come in, it's late." She smiled faintly and turned back toward the door. As she entered, the scent of home, warm food, children's laughter, safety, wrapped around her like an old friend she thought she'd lost. And for the first time in a long while, Juliet felt her heart beat without pain. She knew life would never be what it once was, but it was life nonetheless, fragile, imperfect, and still worth holding on to. My dear listeners, this story reminds us that kindness is a gift, but it must walk hand in hand with wisdom. The heart that helps others must also guard its peace. Do good, yes, but open your eyes while doing it. Don't let guilt or emotions blind you to warning signs. Some storms wear familiar faces, and sometimes the ones we shelter can be the very ones who test our faith. Yet, even after betrayal, never allow pain to turn your heart to stone. Heal, learn, and rise wiser. Kindness should never die, only grow stronger with understanding. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of discernment and the strength to love even when love has wounded us. Lord, guide every listening heart to show kindness with wisdom and compassion with caution. Protect our homes from hidden evil, from deceit that wears the mask of family, from betrayal that creeps through open doors. Restore trust where it has been broken, peace where fear once lived, and light where darkness has lingered too long. May our hearts never grow cold, but may they always beat with divine understanding. Father, bless every listener with peace that passes all understanding. May their homes never experience sorrow like Juliet's, and may their compassion always bring them favor, not pain. As we walk into tomorrow, Lord, keep us safe, keep us strong, and let no hand raised to help ever be used against us. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen, amen, and amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.